Hello, and thank you for joining us today in our studies of 2 Samuel. Today we're in 2 Samuel chapter 8. And as we come into chapter 8, we have the actions of David when it comes to fighting against the other nations. Saul had to go out and fight against the nations round about him as well, and the nations round about would come after Saul. And so this is not necessarily a new situation with David or something where David is just inherently bloodthirsty, but rather that there are great troubles and strifes and wars that are constantly ongoing with the nations round about Israel during the days of David. And so, chapter 8 is going to illustrate several of those battles and several of those wars over a period of years that are going to take place. Let's look at some of the things that we can notice and glean from it beyond just the scope of what it is that David accomplished in defeating his enemies, which he was successful with both north, south, east, and west around Israel. And so let's look at some of the other things that apply to that, but are not necessarily directly from that point in chapter 8. First of all, when you come down to verse number 11, you notice that David is going to dedicate the things that he is going to bring in, the articles of silver, the articles of gold, the articles of bronze, and so on and so forth. He is going to dedicate those things to the Lord. Now, most people would take those things and they would build up their riches, they would build up their wealth, they would make shows of their prosperity, they would build monuments to themselves and this, that, and the other. David doesn't do any of those things. David is going to dedicate those things to the Lord, and what that truly means is those things are going to be set aside for when his son goes to build the temple when he is the king. David is going to have all of the materials already in place. He's going to have everything already laid out. That doesn't mean that David never kept anything for the wealth of his people or for the prosperity of his people, because he does. And yet, large quantities of the things that David captures and the things that David brings back from his triumphs are things that are not going to go to the administration of David. They are going to go into the warehouses of dedication to the Lord. And there is something to be said for this particular attitude and for this particular heart. Because by the same token, when you come down a few verses in chapter 8, you find that just as David is dedicating these things to the Lord, we also find that the Lord is going to preserve David. The Lord is going to watch over David. Verse 14 says that in all the things that David did, the Lord preserved David wherever he went. Just as David is putting God first, God is putting David first. And God is taking care of David in all of his endeavors. When he goes out to battle, he is watching over him, and so on and so forth. You have this situation where David is putting God first, and God is responding to David. Now, in the days of Saul, Saul put himself first. Saul thought that he should be able to do whatever it was he wanted to do, however he wanted to do it. And God is going to respond in a negative way to that kind of mentality. But here with David, David is going to dedicate himself and the things that he has to God. The question then becomes in our lives as Christians, who are we putting first? And who are we living our lives for? Are we living it for ourselves, or are we living it in the service of God? Final thing that I want us to notice this morning is toward the end of the chapter in verse number 15. Where there it talks about David's style of ruling. It says that David was one who ruled over Israel and administered justice and judgment to all his people. David was a fair and an honorable ruler. David was one who believed in justice. He adhered to the law. He was one who administered judgment. Now, was he going to be perfect? No. As we're going to see in the coming chapters, David is going to make mistakes. And David is going to do things that he shouldn't have. And yet, David is going to rule over his people with a heart of justice. There is a difference between ruling over people and being one who actually cares about ruling righteously over people. The world has had many rulers. It has not had many rulers that ruled with righteousness and justice. And yet David is going to be one of those. These are some of the things that I've pulled out of 2 Samuel chapter 8. Hope that they were beneficial to you. Next time we will come back and we will begin examining 2 Samuel chapter 9. But until then, have a great day.